Hello everyone, welcome to Spinning Iris and part 1 of the very special knitting book review. Loom Knitting Primer by Isela Phelps. This is, again, the first edition. I will not be getting the second edition unless somebody gives me a good reason to. Yeah. So, let's get started with this. To start off with this book, let's define primer. It's not primer, apparently. Learned that when I looked up the actual definition for this video. The definition, according to Merriam-Webster, a small book for teaching children to read, a small introductory book on a subject, or a short, informative piece of writing. This is not very short, but it is informative writing. Judging by the definition, we can assume that this book is designed for people who are just beginning loom knitting, or people who need just sort of a handy reference in case they need it. Loom Knitting Primer, a beginner's guide to knitting on a loom with over 30 fun projects, by Isela Phelps. Let's see, original publication in 2007. Right, let's begin. Start off with a nice introduction from the author. Again, she kind of basically reiterates what I said. This book is designed as a hands-on book as well as a reference book for loom knitters. A very tiny bit of loom knitting history, knitting without needles as this little section is called. And then right at the beginning we have a big glossary of keywords, not much in the way of abbreviations. And then talking about the different types of looms, the circular knitting looms, double-sided rake looms, the single-sided rake, which is basically one single row. I don't have one of those actually. A lot of info all at once. Some of the information is rather repetitive. Talking about different looms and suggestions on which looms to buy. Got a handy section here on buying looms, on how to buy a loom. And there's a little table down here for loom gauge, which isn't exactly helpful. But there is a nice page on the other side. It's a quick reference for different, for the different size or different gauge looms, which is definitely more handy than the little table on the other side of the page. It goes into what type of yarns go well with which gauge, sort of. We'll get there. Essential tools. Yeah, not bad. Knitting tool or pick. That's this little guy here. They come like this. I think I've even got some straight ones, but they're typically they look like this. You can also use a crochet hook. Crochet hooks are also recommended. Scissors, of course, your tapestry needles, measuring tape, stitch markers, pins, I guess, for when you're finishing, cable needles, if and when you get to do cables, a calculator. It's apparently handy in calculating gauge, which we'll get to in a second. Then there's another one, this thing called a yarn guide or yarn aid. When I first began loom knitting, I kind of overlooked this because it sounded dumb, but I recently went out and got one. As soon as I'm done with the current project I'm working on, I'll see how this works. It's not that expensive. There's even it's a brief instruction on how to make your own out of an empty ballpoint pen tube, which is basically what that is. It's supposed to make it easier for wrapping, but find out. Also, a row counter, or stitch counter. Row and stitch counter. If you know what I mean, it's a little thing with it's a little mechanical doodad that has numbers on it and helps you count. Of course, what also works is good old-fashioned pen and paper. I have stitch counters or row counters and I barely use them. So use whichever works best for you, which is what the author should have put in there. Yeah, not a bad list of things to have on hand for not just loom knitting but regular knitting as well. Yarn 101 is the next little section. A quick refresher on yarn. And there's so much to consider when it comes to yarn. Yeah, not a bad little table here on what to look at when you're looking at a skein of yarn. Like here's one I got recently. These all got these little labels. Oop, here we go. All got these little labels, and it's just a little table in here. You know, just as an example. So yeah, good page. It's also the gauge indicator, of course, for needle and crochet. And a nice page on the other side with the different types of yarns, the protein-based fibers like Angora, cashmere, wool, mohair, and alpaca. This author's very big on wool, though. And then, of course, the cotton, and then synthetics. Though a lot of the time you'll find the synthetics like acrylic mixed in with the other more organic ones like cotton and wool, and little section on yarn weights. Talks about solid yarn and the variegated yarns. Like this is a variegated yarn, so it's multiple colors versus solid colors, of course. And then novelty yarns, stuff that's a little fuzzy or shiny or, you know, not your typical yarn. So again, a nice page there and a handy little table for the different yarn weights. And an explanation of what they're used for, you know, from sock fingering weight up to bulky. Of course, I think this was made before super bulky was a thing. Let's see, knit gauge, which she hasn't mentioned yet, so those numbers make no sense. And then recommended knitting loom gauge, which is more handy than the line of numbers up above. And then we get to the official part 1 for round loom knitting. So we've got all the history and tools out of the way, on to actually learning how to loom knit. The building blocks. Basically the cast on, which starts with a slip knot. The picture there is good enough. And there's a loom anatomy, and there is a little warning there on that little section about reading the patterns to figure out which way you're knitting, whether you're knitting clockwise or counterclockwise. Yes, the first way to knit, the E-wrap cast on, just basically sort of wrapping around the loop, wrapping around the pegs. The first stitch. Now, what are we talking about here? Using the E-wrap method. So you basically E-wrap once, and then you E-wrap around it again, and then lifting the bottom loop over the top loop. These little helpful blocks here, we're basically reiterating things that were already mentioned. Page 29, there's a note on wrapping the pegs that is repeated on the very same page. It really needs to be there only once. Maybe in a bigger font size to better get the idea across. And this is more E-wrap method stitches, so the double wrap stitch, half stitch. Very good descriptions of what to do, how to do the stitches. We've got the chunky braid stitch, little tips for if the yarn is wrapped too tightly or if the loops become too loose. So, very handy. And now we have a page for finishing. The gathered bind off, which is what you'll mostly see for hats. And then we've got a basic bind off and decent instruction there. Okay, and the yarn over bind off, which is like the basic bind off, only you're using a stitch that has not been taught yet. And there's a nice little block for weaving in the tail ends, which is great because we haven't looked at any projects yet, so okay. Yes, the bane of all knitting, gauge. There's 2 pages here, and honestly, there's not much help. Gauge, I have found, is not explained very well. Always knit a swatch. Problem here. No instruction on how to knit the swatch. To loom, knit a swatch, cast on the number of stitches as called for in the gauge section of the pattern, plus 10 more. I overlooked that in the first swatch that I made. Came out about the same when I used my stitch guide. Okay, and then there's a nice little information there if you have more stitches in the stitching guide than you want, and then if there's too few. Very handy. Doesn't say how to adapt that, but again, a lot of it's trial and error apparently. And then there's some instructions on how to measure gauge. There's this whole little bit here of playing with numbers and figuring out gauge. I understand what it's trying to do, but my brain just kind of shuts off and says, where are the projects? How about you show me in here what I'm supposed to do? This lovely nonsensical section about gauge goes on to the first project. This is the project that started this particular book review. A simple hat. It is indeed a simple hat, and I did not make a new one again because it's problematic. Starts off fine, just basic E-wrap cast on, and then knitting the first row in the chunky braid stitch, which is E-wrap method, and then knitting in the single stitch, which is again E-wrap method. That part is not bad. It's a nice tip there in the bottom corner. If you don't have a bulky yarn, you can use 2 strands of worsted weight or medium weight yarn and sort of hold them together and treat it like a bulky yarn. Anyway, the crown of the hat is where it gets problematic because it is not using the basic cast off. This hat here, the crown, this little piece here, I restarted this hat twice. First time because I had messed up the cast off so badly I just had to start over. And then I had to take it off again, pulled off a few stitches, and then reattached it to the loom to try to do the cast off again. And it took me so long to figure out this stupid cast off that I just said, forget it. I'm just going to read it as it says and hope for the best. What exactly do I mean that this was problematic? Well, this was the Loom. It was recommended the large yellow nifty knitter, which I do have, for adult heads. A weird decrease. Again, another technique that has yet to be taught, decreasing. So basically, moving every third stitch over one space to the right. So we've got 1, 2, 3, moving over to the right. So I have moved one stitch, kind of 1, 2, 3, and then moved that stitch over. Then I moved over beyond the peg that I just removed it from and did 1, 2, 3, and did the same thing. So we've got little spaces. The problem is when you get to the last 2 pegs, you're taking that first stitch off. And the problem in the book is there is no picture describing how to properly do this. Now it says here that 12 pegs will be empty. Let's see how many empty pegs I have here. I've got, starting in here, 11, 12, 13, 14. I have 14 empty pegs. Another way to do it is to go 1, 2, 3, lift it over, and then starting from that naked peg there, going 1, 2, 3, and lifting that over, and so on and so forth. The problem is you end up with even more empty pegs. So yeah, problem. So you can understand my frustration with this. So, big problem with this cast off. It makes no sense. It doesn't work. You kind of have to play it how you see it and just go with what you have. That whole section needs to be rewritten or thrown out completely. It's dumb. There's such a big hole. So, nice hat. Pain in the butt to finish. More cast-ons. Let's see. Cable cast-on, and it says knit over for finishing. Now, is this the knit stitch, which we have not yet learned, or is this the single stitch where you actually pull the loop over instead of the knitting? Again, problem. Chain cast on, which is very similar to the cable cast on. And then we finally get to knitting and purling, which back when I had done this initially, I guess I skipped over this section, or I didn't quite understand it initially because I was very confused because of the E-wrapping method at the beginning. And then suddenly here we are with the actual knit stitch. The overall instructions for the knit stitch are good. Yeah, even the pictures are good too. And purl stitch, again, the perfect opportunity to make a swatch, but it doesn't give an instruction for it. Alright, and then we've got a nice page of knit and purl combinations. So your basic stockinette stitch, straight stitch, knitting every row, reverse stitch, purling every row. Gotcha. Good description. Then we've got garter stitch. I'm going to read this little section. The garter stitch produces a reversible fabric. Both sides of the knitted item will look the same. The two rows together will show on your knitted item as one row of horizontal bumps. Count each row of horizontal bumps as two knitted rows, but one row of garter stitch. I don't like that. A row is a row. And I'll come back to this when I get to the garter stitch project. And rib stitch, self-explanatory, but the loom has to have an even number of pegs. And there should be a big honking star next to that, which there isn't, but I made one of my own. Some moss stitch, or seed stitch, and then double moss stitch, and then we come to the next project, the garter stitch hat. Okay, this was the first project that I did for this round, and that involved making a swatch, which you can definitely see the differences here. This one, can't see the stitches at all. This one you can. So you can imagine me trying to figure out how to measure this swatch for gauge. It's impossible. So scrap that. And this is what I went with. Just says use a large gauge loom. A large gauge loom that you can eventually divide into 4 groups. It's basically divided by 4. It doesn't say that in the instructions until you get towards the decreases and building the crown, which is a little easier than with the simple hat, but still not quite so clear. I'm not sure if I did it correctly. But yeah, it's easy to make. For the seaming, it says to use the mattress stitch, and there is no instruction on how to do the mattress stitch for beginners. So any beginner or somebody who is not familiar with sewing has to go to another resource to look for how to do a mattress stitch. I don't even think I did the mattress stitch. So the decrease section is not worded very well. So for the decrease, you're basically dividing the loom into 4 different sections of 9 stitches, because you're using a very specific loom. That first row is not described very well, and there's no picture to help the newbie, so you just kind of have to work with it, play with it, do what you can. This is the garter stitch hat. I think I knitted it a little bit too long, but that's not the fault of the author, that's mine. But I can make myself a little cuff out of the extra length, or give it to somebody with a bigger head. But it's got a bit of a point. I think I did this part wrong too. Got a little boop at the top. Moving on. Binding off. Using... Okay, so this is more binding off. The double crochet bind off. The pictures for the double crochet especially are very confusing, because it says crochet 1 chain, and then it's for a non-crocheter, for somebody who's beginning to knit and knows nothing about crochet, it's going to be very confusing when they come to actually doing this bind off. Not good. I hate it. It's so frustrating getting crocheting instructions for knitting projects because I don't crochet. See, it is sewn bind off. Haven't actually had a chance to do this yet, but the instructions themselves look okay. Easy to follow. Got contrasting colors. It looks easy to follow. Let's see, linking bind offs. It says transfer to knitting needles, but does not exactly show how to do that. And some more assumptions here that the beginner also knows how to knit regularly using straight needles. I know that. The newbie is not going to. Let's see, grafting. More knitting know-how assumed of beginners and no pictures for grafting. Joining two panels on a knitting loom. It's not explained very well, and the pictures, again, don't line up with the descriptions very well. Oh, there's mattress stitch and no pictures. Making I-cords. Easy enough. Let's see, it says use knit stitch, but the picture shows the stitch lifted like a single stitch. Problem. It only says knit over for the bind off. There's a good tip down there at the bottom. Pull on the cord every couple of rows to set the stitches. The I-cord hot pad. Easy knit. You can literally knit I-cords for hours. The problem is with the pattern itself and putting it together. And it's the problem with most I-cord patterns in general. It says lay flat and coil into a circle, then sew the sides, but it doesn't say or describe how to actually do that. There's no words, no pictures. So once again, the author's making a lot of assumptions about beginning loom knitters and even some experienced loom knitters. So again, I'll have to make it up. And my hot pad is a coaster. Yeah. Nice. Dropped it and fixing mistakes. Yeah, good enough. Joining yarns. Again, decent instructions there. Creating flat panels. Finally. This should have been brought up earlier, like under swatches, maybe. Thing about selvage. Picture might be helpful, but other than that, okay. And then turning stitch options. I don't like that it is here because it's a little misleading being right next to a project that it's not even relevant to. And that is a trendy scarf using a funky fur. This yarn choice is a bit outdated, and I did it wrong too. I either cast on 12 and lost 2 stitches in the process, or I just cast on 10 and didn't realize that it was supposed to be 12. Anyway, easy pattern, outdated yarn. Shaping. Increase, okay, doesn't clarify flat or round. For make one, instructions are okay, the picture 2 doesn't do as good a job of showing what you're doing. Pick one goes from flat to round in picture 2, so it could be a little confusing. Smart shaping should be on the previous page, maybe when you're actually talking about shaping. Put the make ones on the same page instead of side by side on 2 different pages. I don't know. Not really organized very well. Because there's another make one, the lifted increase, which I imagine you'd do with more flat pieces, but it doesn't really say that on there. The instructions for the lifted increase are okay, except maybe needs another picture that actually shows how to catch the running ladder that it describes. Row below sounds confusing, like lifting increase, and there are no pictures to help show you what you're supposed to be doing for it. Let's see. Next page, decreases. the knit 2 together and the slip slip knit, and the purl 2 together. Just pretty self-explanatory. All the instructions there are good. Described well. The pictures are fine. Let's see. Increasing 2 stitches or more. Okay. So the practice project here for shaping is the rainbow fish pillow. Here it is. It sort of looks like the picture, except mine's got more of a chunky ball. It's more chunky. It's got a bit of a belly here. It's because of how my brain works. The lifted increase is not easy. I'm not even sure I was doing it correctly. Let's see, knit 8 rows of garter stitch. How about, instead of that nonsense, just row 1 purl, row 2 knit, and repeat for 14 more rows, or whatever more rows. Or 16 rows in the garter stitch pattern. Don't confuse the newbies. It's a good thing that it said knit a total of 16 rows, otherwise somebody who wasn't paying attention to the garter stitch page would do just a knit purl row and then be like, wait a minute, this doesn't look right. Because it isn't right, it's dumb. And there is no instruction on sewing it together. It just says fix a button to represent the eye using tapestry needle and matching yarn. Sew and stuff the body of the fish. But yeah, my funky fish. And that's it for part 1. Part 2 will be a bit project heavy. There's a lot of projects, and then get into the board knitting, which may mean a part 3. We'll have to wait and see how quickly I can knock out these projects. One that follows the fish is a little complicated. Just a little bit complicated. Thanks for watching. Come and join me on the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.